Hi all, today is a big day for us. I am very happy to introduce you to a truly incredible new instrument developed by Oceans with Synthesis in collaboration with Sonora Cinematic, Porphyra Hybrid. Porphyra is a hybrid synth that pairs a powerful wavetable engine with a unique sampler, making extensive use of Contact 8's new features. Porphyra is one of the very first third-party instruments made for Contact 8, but you don't have to own Contact 8 to fully enjoy it, as it runs on the completely free Contact player with full NKS integration. I'm going to show you everything you need to know about Porphyra. It will probably be a long video, so please make sure you make good use of the timestamps. Before I get started, let's listen to some of my favorite sounds. As I already mentioned, Porphyra is a hybrid instrument made of two parts that work together, a powerful wavetable engine in layer A and a sampler in layer B. We'll go through each feature, but for now I just want to mention that at the end of each layer you'll have a dedicated filter that you can turn on and off, and for the wavetable you also have a stereo spread control. As I'm sure you have already worked out, the central control over here blends the two signals together. And at the bottom of the GUI you have a filter section, a master filter section with several different filter modes and three envelopes. The first two are hardwired to amplitude and filter, so this will be the filter cutoff, and the last envelope is a sort of a generic modulation envelope that you can assign to any of the 9 available targets. So the modulation possibilities are already quite a lot. But Porphyra also offers 5 different LFOs. The first 4 are identical and can be assigned to several different targets. And the last one is called LFOX and is kind of special. We'll see why in a minute. And to finish off this kind of very quick overview, we have an effects section with 4 different slots and a very important options section where you have a bunch of target possibilities for external modulators like velocity and polyphonic aftertouch and mod wheel, and several other features like polyphony and pitch bend behaviors which you can assign from here. You'll also find a manual and a built-in sound design tips, which I really recommend reading because they're quite fun. Before we explore every feature in detail, I would strongly recommend that you make sure you go on View and make sure that the info panel is set to on in contact. And the reason for that is that Ocean Swift Synthesis really spend a lot of time making sure that there are a lot of tips and detailed explanation under each control, and it will appear down here. And you do need to have the info panel on to be able to see this. Let's start talking about the wavetable. If you're not familiar with wavetable synthesis, you can think of it as a collection of single cycle waveforms stored in a table that we can scan through. If you want a more practical metaphor, imagine a series of waveform pictures filed in a cabinet. Now, imagine flicking through them at the speed you want while hearing in real time what each picture sounds like. And that's what wavetable synthesis essentially is. Porphyra hosts a truly huge collection of very high quality wavetables that you can use. You find them in this menu when the wavetable mode is set to table over here. Let's select the first one, which is a sine wave that goes to a triangular wave and that can morph through the waveform using morph. You do have a fun little visualization thing that I can show you, which is that when you're in table mode, you can click on the display to have a 3D visualization of the morph over here. Let's look at this with a more complicated wavetable, and you can see that now if I go on morph, it will show in real time all the different waveforms that I'm morphing through. There is an alternative mode for the wavetable called cycle, which is a collection of single cycle waveforms. In this mode, the wavetable layer will work as a traditional oscillator and the morph control will disappear. What we learned so far, let's try and program a first sound. I'm gonna move everything to layer A, so that's all we can hear. I'm gonna set the wavetable layer to table, and let's pick something fun. How about harmonics? That's a cool, very pure kind of sound. So now what I want to do is to modulate this morph control. And you can hear how it goes through the whole harmonic series, which is pretty cool. So let's start from 0 again, and then I'm gonna go into the mod envelope and look for wavetable morph as a destination. I'm gonna put the depth to maybe 70, 75%, something like that. Let's increase the attack quite a lot so I can make sure that my sound goes very slowly through the harmonic series. Very cool. Let's make sure that the amp envelope is kind of like this. A longer attack and trying to make a sort of a pad sound. Very nice. We have this very pure tone on layer A. Let's look for something a little rougher and harmonically rich on layer B. How about a sawtooth wave? Now I'll go back in the middle and I can mix the two signals. Next we're gonna add a filter. Let's keep it to ladder low pass 2, which will be a 12 dB per octave filter. I'm gonna close it quite a bit. And I want to go into the filter envelope and set up attack for about maybe 2.5 seconds, something like that. A longish decay sustained to the max with some release, and I'm going to make sure the depth is at about 60%, something like that. Let's see how it sounds. I very much like this harmonic series that is morphed and mixed to the sawtooth, and I'm gonna add some effects. Let's make sure that we add some reverb. I'm gonna go to Realm, which is one of my favorite reverbs actually, and let's pick a preset so that we don't need to start programming anything. Let's go for Dreamy maybe. This should give you a clear idea of what wavetable synthesis sounds like. We also touched on the amp and filter envelopes, but Porphyra has quite a few more cards up its sleeve. Harmonic, for example, which we can activate, is a pretty cool one. This control adds an additional wavetable to the signal, which you can then detune. Let's try it. Can hear how it's detuned. All the way up is basically an octave up, but I want like a very slight detuning, something like this. Note that the behavior of this control is very much dependent on the harmonic content of the original wavetable that you're using. So the effect is more or less subtle depending on what you have selected over here. And if I select a wavetable with a very light harmonic content, the effect will be barely noticeable. Let's move to the wave shapers, a feature of Porphyra that makes it particularly powerful. If you're an experienced sound designer, you'll be very familiar with the first shaper width over here, which essentially controls the width of the waveform of the wavetable cycle. If we select a square wave, you recognize what is commonly known as pulse width modulation. So I'm going to set the wavetable to cycle mode. Let's look for a square, and here's what width does. But you can do this with any sort of waveform, which is kind of cool. Now let's try this with a couple of different sources. On top of width, you have a second available shaper, which can use any of the 22 included algorithms to warp the waveform. Let's try a couple. Trying all the different algorithms is well beyond the scope of this walkthrough, but I do really encourage you to try them out. There is a huge amount of different ways you can shape a waveform, and I really had lots of fun just trying them all. Now we get to a very interesting part, which is a brand new feature of Contact A that we use to the max, the mod oscillator. Yaron, one of the two owners of Oceans with Synthesis, was the former product manager for Contact and Native Instruments, and he was directly involved in the development of the synthesis-related features of Contact 8. Quite a few things we saw so far would have been either very hard or impossible to develop in previous versions of Contact. But this one really is brand new. What this next session allows you to do is to add frequency and phase modulation to your sound design arsenal using an extra built-in oscillator. You can choose the wave shape and the frequency of the mod oscillator using these two knobs over here. You'll see that the frequency knob has a menu above over here that will allow you to define the type of tuning you can use for the oscillator. Your choice here will essentially depend on the type of modulation algorithm you'll choose. You have semitones, XY, which are essentially fixed ratios, and hertz. Let's go into semitones for now. And here you will be able to see all of the different algorithms that represent all the ways the internal oscillator interacts with the wavetable layer. You have FM and phase modulation in both directions, feedbacks, ring mod, and a simple but very useful one, mod mix, which essentially means that rather than using the oscillator for modulation purposes, you can mix its signal back in, creating, for example, a sub-oscillator. Let's try doing this very quickly. So I can add mod mix, and I'm going to choose a sine wave, and I'm gonna set the frequency to -12 semitones, so I have 1 octave below the key that I am pressing. A little tip for this one: if it's hard to select exactly 12 semitones, what I recommend doing is holding Shift, and you'll be able to really fine tune it. This without, and now I'm going to increase the depth of the oscillator, which in this case will basically be a volume control. Let me show you a couple of cool sounds that use the mod oscillator. Let's start with one of the first one that I showed you earlier in this video. It's called the cinematic intro. It's one of my presets, the very first one actually. So I'm gonna double click on it. And here you'll see that the extra oscillator is used for FM into the wavetable. I'm going to increase the depth. Very cool. I have another sound in mind that actually uses the extra oscillator for ring modulation. Let's search for it in the presets. This one is by Fernando. By the way, Porphyra comes with over 450 presets, so really a huge selection. Let's go into Abstract Sub 2, and this is the ring modulator. I'm going to change depth. And this will obviously change enormously if I change the morph control. And on this one, I also love the shaper. Really growly. And the last one I want to show you is called Feet in the Air, Head Up in the Clouds by Yarrow. And this is another cool one that actually uses the mod mix rather than as a sub-oscillator for an octave up effect. And these are sort of very cool ambient keys. And again, let's change the depth. And again, for the mod mix, the depth is essentially a volume control for the oscillator. Now let's move to layer B, the sampler. Porphyra offers a large selection of really cool sound sources, from analog and digital synths to noise to actual acoustic instruments and more. Let's play with some. I am back to the harmonic sound that I created earlier over here. And I'm going to move my layer control all the way to the right so that we can audition some of these samples. I'm gonna start with analog, and bear in mind, by the way, I still have the filter on and the dreamy reverb we set up while programming this sound in Wavetable. And in analog, I want to kind of find a counterpart to the very pure sound that I have in layer A. We already tried with a saw wave, but let's try with something a bit more colorful. Let's try one of the unison waves, which sound really fat. Okay, now I'm going to show you something that is actually very useful. We're gonna dip into the options tab for a second. I want to use the mod wheel to crossfade between layer A and B. And of course, I could go here, just right click and MIDI learn to MIDI CC1. But if I go to options, I can find wheel and you'll see all the different targets for wheel. And I can go to layer and set it to mix A and B. And now if I move my mod wheel, very cool. The sample layer has also a couple of interesting elements that we can explore. Other than adjusting the sample start, which I really like and it's really useful, you can also randomize the sample start on each single note, which is really cool to give your patch a bit of an organic feeling. And you can actually do something similar in the wavetable layer, which we didn't really explore. You can randomize the phase of the wavetable on each note over here. I find myself using these features mostly when programming shorter sounds or polyphonic patches, but they are useful and interesting in a number of scenarios. You probably also noticed that both layer A and B share the exact same sounds in cycle mode. It's cool because while they are the same sounds, one is being played as a sample and the other one is played as a single cycle wavetable, which will give them a very slightly different quality. This also means that you can detune them to get a classic big two-voice unison sound. Let's try this. Let's choose a saw wave, maybe. And I'm gonna put the layer control right in the middle. Let's make sure that the reverb is off for a second. I'm gonna put the wet to 0 so that we can actually hear the effect. And I'm going to set this one to be slightly detuned. Could even pan them a little bit. And let's bring the reverb back on. Sampler has many sounds, anything from voices to guitars, a bassoon, a violin, analog oscillators. The sky's the limit. Make sure you spend some time trying them all. You can import your own samples both in the sampler and in the Wavetable layer, which is really super cool. You can set both layers to users, and this will transform into a drag and drop area. So I'm going to drag and drop this sample over here, for example. And Porphyra automatically analyzes the pitch of the incoming sample and maps it accordingly. Keep in mind that for the Wavetable layer, you obviously need to add samples that make sense used as wavetables. I have a nice wavetable over here, which I can drag and drop. Porphyra expects frame sizes of 2048 samples. If you don't know what that means, you can just Google it. There are a few good methods to make wavetables. I'm probably also going to make a video on my personal channel about this very soon. One software I use quite often for this, which you can check out, is WaveEdit. I'll put a link in the description down below. It's also cool because the website contains a library of wavetables you can download and use with Porphyra. The other really cool component of Porphyra Hybrid is the big availability of modulation sources, which makes it really perfect for creating ever-evolving cinematic sounds. We already had a look at the three envelopes over here while creating the wavetable sound. Just to recap them briefly, you have the first envelope, which is hardwired to the amplitude of the sound, the second one, which is hardwired to the filter cutoff, and the third one is free and can be assigned to any of the available targets. On top of the envelopes, you get 5 LFOs in total. The first 4 are pretty standards and identical. You find everything you'd expect from an LFO, so different shapes, and then a rate that can be tempo synced, and then a bipolar depth control and phase. The last LFO, LFOX, is kind of special. Let's explore it together. LFOX has a couple of powerful, interesting quirks. The first one is that shape is not set in stone. So every time I click on the wave control and at each click, Porphyra will generate a new random waveform by internally mixing different shapes. The second unique thing about LFOX, which is probably one of my favorite features of Porphyra overall actually, is that LFOX can be faded in for up to 10 seconds. So again, this is really cool for creating evolving paths. Let's try one right away. Let's try this on the sound that we're already working on with my user wavetable and sample. I'm gonna leave these on Mix AB. I'm gonna click wave a couple of times. Let's see what that offers. I'm gonna use kind of a slow rate, something like that. I'm gonna set the LFOX to retrig, and I'm gonna set up a fading time of about 1 second. Let's try this. You heard how it sort of came in after a second. Let's increase the time to maybe 10 seconds. And here it is. One warning that I have about this is that you'll be fully able to appreciate the fade in only if the LFO is set to retrig like we just did. If let run freely, the fade in time might have elapsed before you actually press a note and you won't actually notice it. Let's have a look at the effects section. As I mentioned, there are 4 different slots. These are really cool and most of them are pretty new additions to Contact from Native Instruments. The 4 slots are creative. Here you find anything from overdrives and distortion to a ring modulator to a really cool programmable gator, which we'll spend some time on later in the video. Mod as choruses, flangers, vibrato, and other modulation type sounds. And at the bottom, you'll have the spatial effects, so different types of delays and reverbs. All these effects sound very good. You'll probably be familiar with many, and I encourage you to explore them further, but I want to spend an extra minute on the gator. The gator is particularly cool because it has a couple of interesting options. First, you can activate it independently on each layer, so either just on the wavetable or just on the sample. But then you can also flip one particular layer. So that means that for a specific layer, it mirrors the behavior of the gator on the other layer, taking opposite values as they happen. So something like this, for example. You can also randomize or flip the whole thing. So this leads to a lot of really creative effects, which I personally really like. To finish this off, let's have a look at the options section. I already mentioned that here you find some very useful sound design tips and polyphony settings, but this is also an important section for setting up external modulation. This should be all fairly self-explanatory, so let me just give you a couple of examples. For example, here I have velocity and I can assign it to LFO 1, 2, 3, 4, and by the way, all these can be stacked together. So for example, I can add velocity to control LFO 1 and the filter at the same time. Let me show you how this works. I'm going to find an init patch. And let's put something that we can actually filter. So for example, a single cycle sawtooth wave. And then in option, I can set up the velocity to control the filter cutoff, as we just saw. And I'm going to bring the filter all the way down. Let's bring something actually quite a bit aggressive. Let's try a ladder or state variable filter. And now the harder I press a key, the more my filter will be open. And let's try this with some fuzz, just for fun. And I'm gonna try this with legato. And I'm also gonna add some chorus. I'll add some plate reverb. And this is a good place to mention that Porphyra has full polyphonic aftertouch capabilities, which you will appreciate if you have a polyphonic aftertouch capable controller like the Mark III generation of Native Instruments control keyboards. I don't have one with me, but I can use my beloved Osmos. I'll show you how well this works with a couple of presets. This Haunted Spacecraft 1 has a very good use of polyphonic aftertouch. So I'm gonna try it on my Osmos. And let's find another one that was a very cool one that was called Sosego. Let me find it. There you go, one of these three. Let's try one. Really expressive and cool with the Osmos. The sound design possibilities are really huge. If you want to get Porphyra Hybrid, you can do so at sonoracinematic.com. It is currently on a limited intro offer. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.